government for grievances is in the very best tradition of America. No history of the United States, no recounting of the unending struggle to live up to our founding promises would be complete without recognition of the peaceful movements that have pushed this nation forward. From the abolitionists, to the suffragettes, to the countless brave and heroic souls who marched in support of the civil rights movement, peaceable assemblies have moved mountains in this country. And they still can. When America saw the horrifying video of a police officer killing George Floyd, a brutal killing that evoked for many the nation's long history of racial discrimination and injustice, Americans rightly and peaceably assembled to demand justice, justice for every American, regardless of skin color. But what began as legitimate protests against a vile act of abuse, sadly, were soon hijacked by opportunists and violent radicals. By early June, rioters had injured more than 700 law enforcement officers across the country and had murdered David Dorn, a retired officer who served St. Louis with honor for many years. They also damaged or destroyed countless buildings and businesses. In Minneapolis alone, rioters burned affordable housing and damaged over 400 businesses, many of them owned by African Americans, at a cost of well over $500 million in damages. In Philadelphia, police cars were set ablaze. In Seattle, rioters who damaged hundreds of buildings were granted and allowed to set up a so-called autonomous zone by local officials who all too predictably resulted in more crime, including 4 shootings that cost 2 young people their lives. The fact is, the people who took the streets because their hearts cried out for justice have become overshadowed by rioters and looters and those who cynically exploit the protest for their own evil ends. And those rioters aren't concerned about racial justice. Indeed, they're willing to make a mockery of the peaceful protest to advance their violent objectives. Their actions are profoundly racist, the rioters, as they destroy minority communities, minority businesses, and minority lives across this country. This shouldn't be complicated. Peaceful protests must be protected. Riots must be stopped. No one has a right to assault another person, to firebomb a building, to throw a Molotov cocktail into a police car. That's not exercising a constitutional right. That is terrorizing your fellow citizens. More and more, we're seeing signs that a significant portion of this violence, of this rioting, is not random, it's not spontaneous. Rather, it is coordinated and inspired by leftist, anarchist groups like Antifa, that will, without shame, exploit a national tragedy to attack American buildings, American homes, and American lives. This is happening in my home state, in Austin and in Dallas. And it's happening across the country, whether in Minneapolis, Nevada City, Pittsburgh, or Toledo, to name a few. But tragically, nowhere more so than in Portland, Oregon. In Portland, Antifa and other radicals have thrown metal pipes at DHS officers and used commercial-grade lasers to try to blind them, perhaps permanently. They launched mortar-style attacks with commercial-grade fireworks. They firebombed a federal courthouse. This is not peaceful protest. This violence speaks for itself. But for good measure, in graffiti on the county courthouse, they wrote, "Until the police and ICE are abolished, we will burn this city down piece by piece." They are telling us what their demands are: to shut down and abolish the police. This violence should be universally condemned. All 100 senators ought to come together and say, don't murder your fellow citizens, don't attack police officers, protect each other's rights. Instead of seeing leaders united, we're seeing too many local officials, mayors and governors, who've made a cynical decision that it's in their partisan interest to turn a blind eye to this violence, to turn a blind eye to the law enforcement officers being attacked on a nightly basis, and even worse than that, to demonize the police officers, to throw out terms like stormtroopers and Gestapo to describe federal law enforcement officers doing their jobs. It's for that reason that I've introduced legislation called the Reclaim Act. The Reclaim Act provides that if you as an American, if you are injured, if your property is damaged, if your home is burned to the ground, if your business is looted and destroyed during a riot, as a result of a decision of political leaders to deny you police protection, that you have a federal cause of action to sue the municipality or the city that has denied you police protection and has willfully looked the other way while your life was endangered, while your home or business was burned to the ground. Denying fair protection of law enforcement is a civil rights violation for any American who is denied. Just days after George Floyd was killed, Representative John Lewis, whose passing the nation just mourned, he said, quote, "Rioting, looting, and burning is not the way. Organize, demonstrate, sit in, stand up, vote." Representative Lewis is exactly right. We all have a right to free speech, and we should protect that right vigorously. But we should also be united in condemning political violence and condemning domestic terrorism, and to understand just what is happening on the ground, what the heroic men and women of law enforcement are facing right now. It's helpful to see directly what's occurring, and there's a video that should display this now.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. To stand up for freedom together, so let freedom reign.
A passionate movement for justice is finding itself swept under the feet of rampaging and destructive mobs.
People will do what they do.
A myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
77-year-old David Dorn was shot to death as a pawn shop he was protecting was being looted.
Federal Protective Service officer Dave Underwood was killed. Authorities say it was a targeted attack on law enforcement.
This is ridiculous. These people are tearing up our livelihood.
I will note at the end of that video that is narrated, it says, describes law enforcement officers as unidentified, while the video shows them with the words police in bright yellow all caps across their chest. So that is a curious way to describe a law enforcement officer as unidentified. I would also note that the ranking member said nobody is condoning the violence and rioting, and yet nowhere in the opening remarks was even one word condemning it, condemning the assaults, condemning the 277 injuries that federal law enforcement officers have suffered at the hands of those rioters. Not a word. Not a word was said about the murder of federal law enforcement officer Patrick Underwood. Not a word was said about the murder of retired St. Louis police officer David Dorn, both of whom are African American, and both of whom were murdered. And we're told we don't condone this. We simply won't say a negative word about this terrorism. Our first panel consists of two government witnesses. The first is Ms. Erin Neely Cox from my home state of Texas, and the second is Mr. Ken Cuccinelli from the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Cox currently serves as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas and is the co-head of the Department of Justice's Task Force on Violent Anti-Government Extremists. Immediately prior to her appointment as U.S. Attorney, Ms. Cox was a senior advisor at McKinsey & Company in the cybersecurity and risk practice. Before that, she spent nearly a decade as an assistant U.S. Attorney in the office she now leads, and served as the Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel in the Office of Legal Policy in the U.S. Department of Justice. Ms. Cox began her legal career with clerkships for Judge Henry A. Politz of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and for Judge H. Barefoot Sanders of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas. She earned her J.D. from the Dedman School of Law at the Southern Methodist University and her Bachelor's of Business Administration from the University of Texas at Austin. Our second witness is Mr. Ken Cuccinelli, who is the senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. In that role, he oversees many of the department's functions that are vital to its mission of safeguarding the American people and our homeland. Before assuming his current position, Mr. Cuccinelli served in the Virginia State Senate from 2002 to 2010, and from 2010 to 2014, he served as the Attorney General of Virginia. Before serving the public in these positions, Mr. Cuccinelli worked in private legal practice. Mr. Cuccinelli earned a J.D. and an M.A. in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Virginia. I would ask each of the witnesses to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated, and Ms. Cox will start with you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirona, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Erin Neely Cox, United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas and Chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Justice Department's effort to counter violent anti-government extremism. For me, it's a topic that hits close to home. A little over a year ago, in June, a gunman clad in military gear and carrying an AR-15 style rifle opened fire on the federal courthouse in Dallas, which houses not only the federal judiciary, but also my office, the U.S. Attorney Office, and many other offices. The sudden violence ripped through the morning, just as we were arriving for work that day. Several of my prosecutors and others were caught in the midst of the attack. They resorted to hiding behind cars in the parking lot, and one was pushed into a doorway by an FPS officer just as the bullets whizzed past them both. Our office will be forever grateful to the FPS officers who engaged the shooter, ending the attack before innocent lives were lost. To this day, we remain rattled by the gunman's anti-government motives. He chose his location for a reason. A courthouse is one of the essential nodes within the body politic. It's where laws are upheld, where justice is meted out. To target a courthouse and those who work there is to target the core of our lawful society. And Dallas is no stranger to assault on the rule of law. 3 years prior, just blocks from the federal courthouse, a gunman targeting law enforcement ambushed police during a Black Lives Matter protest, 5 officers were killed. 11 others were injured, including 9 officers. This was the deadliest single incident for law enforcement in the United States since 9/11. That day in July 2016 is certainly something etched in our memory. Just as the bullet holes still etched in the federal courthouse's facade from the shooter last year remind us daily, anti-government fanaticism did not emerge with the 2020 protest. But as our citizens have organized lawful demonstrations across the country following the tragic events in Minneapolis, anarchists continue to exploit this lawful First Amendment activity as a shield for their violent behavior. Somehow, the notion of committing violence in the name of an anti-government dogma, be it Antifa, Boogaloo, or any of the other espoused ideologies, has been gaining traction at an alarming rate. Unlike the lawful protesters whose demonstrations they undermine, these anti-government extremists aim to tear down the rule of law in America, not improve it. In fact, resorting to violence, they are drowning out the voices of the protesters that this country wants to hear. We've recently seen anti-government violence making headlines all across the nation. Just a few examples. In Seattle, during an anarchist occupation of the Capitol Hill area, an individual allegedly set fire to a police precinct. Thankfully, protesters rushed in to help extinguish the blaze. In Portland, a would-be anarchist outside the federal courthouse allegedly attacked a deputy U.S. Marshal with a large hammer, landing blows on the officer's neck and shouting expletives as other deputies had to pull him off. On the courthouse barricade were scribbled the letters ACAB, an acronym for All Cops Are Bastards. In Oakland, a violent extremist allegedly used a peaceful protest as a cover to murder an FPS officer stationed at the federal courthouse, firing directly at the officer and his partner before taking off. In response to this type of violence, Attorney General Barr directed U.S. Attorney Craig Carpenito for the District of New Jersey and me to lead a task force to combat violent anti-government extremism. Working in close collaboration with the FBI, the task force aims to investigate and prosecute extremists of all persuasions. We will follow where the evidence leads us, investigating any person or group who plans to commit or commits violence in the name of anarchist ideology. Our goal is to focus on cases where violent extremists commit federal crimes and seek ways to disrupt and prevent these criminal acts before they harm Americans. Of course, let me be clear with this final point. Adhering to a repugnant ideology is not a crime, nor is expressing those beliefs. The right to freedom of speech is enshrined in our First Amendment, but committing violence or inciting violence in order to further that dogma is a criminal act and is one that we should all take very seriously. Extremist violence endangers our community. It endangers our law enforcement, but as importantly, it also interferes with citizens' right to speak freely and assemble peacefully. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cox. Mr. Cuccinelli.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirono, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of Homeland Security's role in protecting against the continued assaults by criminals and violent extremists in the city of Portland, and more specifically, the federal courthouse and the federal law enforcement officers there. For more than 2 months now, federal property and federal law enforcement officers in Portland have been under assault. In July, it occurred every single night until the end of the month. Violent extremists in Portland have perverted the peaceful protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's tragic death. As we begin, it's important to be crystal clear about this. Rioters are not protesters, and protesters are not rioters. To confuse the two does a grave disservice to the critical place for peaceful protest in our country. Let me be clear. The department fully supports the rights of peaceful protesters. We will never abandon our mission to safeguard those precious and hard-fought freedoms. But DHS did not have to expand its presence in Portland because of peaceful protesters. And that's why I'm sitting before you today. For more than 60 days, the situation in Portland has devolved into nothing more than continuous nightly riots and life-threatening violence targeting federal law enforcement and the institutions they diligently defend under the mandate given to them by Congress. These rioters have assaulted federal property, federal officers, local law enforcement personnel, and facilities with hammers, lasers, baseball bats, fireworks, Molotov cocktails, chemicals, and other weapons. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, Congress in 40 U.S.C. 1315 directs the Secretary to use DHS law enforcement personnel in order to protect federal property and persons on that property. The Federal Protective Service protects over 9,000 facilities every day pursuant to that law. And it's a role that FPS has performed at the Hatfield Courthouse since it opened in 1997 and around the country since the beginning of FPS in 1971. 40 U.S.C. 1315 is further pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1, 9, and 18 of the Constitution. Contrary to what some may think, you should be pleased to know that we do not have the option, nor do we ever intend, to abandon the mission that Congress assigned to us. Some people who are more interested in telling a story than in truth have made up a number of lies related to federal officers in Portland. Here are some facts for the record and for anyone who still cares about truth. All DHS law enforcement personnel in Portland are trained in the conduct of appropriate tactics and procedures to conduct our missions while protecting civil liberties and promoting public safety and the safety of our officers. DHS law enforcement officers who interact with crowds are all identifiable by their law enforcement agency and individually. The use of unmarked vehicles by law enforcement is common to avoid potential attacks by criminals on a nightly basis. Violent extremists across the country have intentionally attacked marked police vehicles and attempted to set them on fire, including with officers in them. In closing, Mr. Chairman, let me affirm to the committee and the American people that DHS will not back away from our responsibilities to protect federal property, the people using those properties, and our brave law enforcement officers. We remain disappointed that select federal, state, and local leaders prefer to demonize law enforcement while kowtowing to violent criminals who set fire to our cities, destroy local businesses, and target law enforcement officers for harm or even death. I'd remind this committee that it was a DHS law enforcement officer who was first killed in the violence following George Floyd's tragic death. PSO Patrick Underwood was gunned down while protecting a federal building and a peaceful protest in Oakland, California. PSO Underwood was African American. His white partner also suffered 3 bullet wounds but survived. As I sit here, I am unaware of a single one of the politicians who have demonized law enforcement around the country expressing regret at the death of PSO Underwood. That difference speaks volumes. DHS knows the difference between peaceful protesting and violence and terrorism. This country cannot survive allowing mob rule to replace the rule of law. Those hurling Molotov cocktails and explosives in Portland are not just attacking a federal courthouse, they're attacking the very foundation that makes the enjoyment of our natural rights possible, the rule of law itself. With that, I'm happy to take questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to both of you for your testimony, and let me say to both of you, thank you also for your service working to keep Americans safe. Ms. Cox, let me start with you. How many active cases does the Department of Justice or the FBI have, either cases or investigations into violence, rioting, or terrorism that has derived from these riots we've seen?
Well, I can speak directly to the FBI, Chairman. They have, since May 28th, over 300 investigations, domestic terrorist investigations. That does not include any potential civil rights investigations or violent crime associated with the riots, but 300 domestic terrorist investigations that have been opened since May 28th.
Mr. Cuccinelli, Speaker Pelosi and another senior House Democrat have referred to federal law enforcement officers working for the Department of Homeland Security as stormtroopers and Gestapo. Are there any stormtroopers or Gestapo working for DHS right now?
No, Mr. Chairman, they're not, and it's an extremely negative and hyperbolic libel by those individuals on people who are doing their duty as professionally as they can, not just in Portland, but around the country, protecting, including those of us in this building. It's very sad to see. I'm a former Attorney General. I know there are a number of them on this committee. We've all worked with law enforcement on an intimate basis, and to see that kind of characterization of people who every day get up, they're the only people in America who get up, go to work, and we ask them to put a gun on and stand between us and evil every day. And these folks do it, they do it dutifully, and they do it professionally, and that includes in Portland, Mr. Chairman.
What does it do to officer morale when elected Democrats are calling them Nazis?
You know, there's just something out of bounds about the Nazi illusions. I don't know why these folks get away with it, but you know, when they're facing an unusual threat, in FPS's 49 years since 1971, they have dealt with approximately 900 protests a year on average recently, and yet in all of those years, in all of those cities, they have never dealt with a situation like Portland. I will say that they keep one another's morale up, but many of them are just aghast at the notion that people who are using every form of weapon, this is a water bottle, frozen, and they're getting thrown at our officers, the simplest thing in the world. And pipes, fireworks, chemicals, Molotov cocktails, and yet you continually hear people who know that what they're saying is not true about these officers repeat it. Even in the introductory video, these are unidentified, and conveniently enough, the narrator identified the location on those officers' uniforms where you can see who they work for, which agency even within the Department of Homeland Security. And that's true for all of the officers who've been interacting with all these crowds. So they're a little bit, they understand that it's politics, but a lot of them just think it's gone way, way too far, particularly given how they go out every day and do their duty.
All three Democratic senators who've spoken at this hearing so far, Senator Hirono, Senator Wyden, and Senator Merkley, they all use the identical phrase, secret police. Mr. Cuccinelli, do you deploy secret police? Does DHS send secret police out into the world, and is that what's happening in Portland?
We have no troops. We have no secret police. And I would note, you know, Senator Merkley, I like the flower picture, but he said that since the arrangement was made, he didn't characterize it this way, with Governor Brown to finally bring in state law enforcement to do what Portland wouldn't do, and that's police many of the streets of Portland, that things have been rosy. Well, last night, the local police declared a riot. Last night, not the federal, but the local police.
So, Mr. Cuccinelli, I'm looking at that poster behind you, and I see in bright yellow in all caps the word police, and we're pretty far away. In COVID times, we're pretty spread out. How exactly is someone with giant all caps police across their chest, how are they secret police? What am I missing?
Nothing secret about it, and for those who have questions why we use police, it's because it's the internationally recognized identification of law enforcement.
But by the way, they're also focusing on unmarked cars. Now, to the best of my knowledge, every law enforcement agency of any size or scope uses unmarked vehicles. Is there any reason why law enforcement might want to use unmarked vehicles in an active riot?
Well, in other active riots around the country, we've seen those marked vehicles targeted, as I said, with officers in them. We have attempted
and firebombed, literally lit on fire.
Yes, quite intentionally. That's exactly right.
Senator Merkley also said that President Trump withdrew the federal law enforcement officers, and that afterwards the protests have been peaceful. Now, as I understand it, both of those statements are objectively false. Is it true that the president has withdrawn federal officers from Portland, number one? And number two, is it true that the protests have been peaceful since then?
No, as I noted, even last night, the local police declared a riot. So last Monday, discussions finally began after multiple requests on our part with Governor Brown to have the state police come in and engage and do the two things that we have been asking them to do for 2 months. And that is engage in cooperative policing, which is always our goal, and frankly, it exists virtually everywhere else in the country but Portland, and to clear the parks across the street that have performed as a staging ground for those conducting violent assaults.
So last question, Mr. Cuccinelli. In the last 6 months, how many officer injuries have occurred in Portland?
The latest count is 277 injuries.
277 injuries.
Yes, to approximately 140 officers.
So that is not indicative of a peaceful protest, is it?
No, it is not. That's why I said rioters aren't protesters and protesters aren't rioters. There's a difference.
And Mr. Cuccinelli, it is commonplace in law enforcement that if there's a significant use of force, that use of force is reviewed afterwards, is it not?
Yeah, that is automatic within the Department of Homeland Security. That is a built-in oversight element of our procedures.
And of course, there are no such constraints on rioters or terrorists or murderers.
Of course not.
I would also note briefly on the exchange on the press. It is my understanding that some of the rioters are now identifying themselves as press. And I just want to be clear that if someone has an identification of press and they engage in violent conduct, they physically assault an officer, they're not magically immune from the criminal laws if they engage in a violent assault. Is that right?
That is correct. And in Portland, there was an incident with local law enforcement, between local law enforcement and press, that led to a federal court order that was later extended circumstantially without a similar type of incident, in our view, to all law enforcement, meaning federal law enforcement as well, and we've respected that order. But upon the implementation of that order, just as you described, Mr. Chairman, suddenly people started sprouting wearing all black block and press.
All black block, you mean the uniform of these rioters,
yes,
essentially?
Yes, that makes it hard to distinguish one from the other, which is the purpose of wearing the black block, and also to make it for quick changes so they can change their appearance as well. And so more of them are now doing that with the addition of press across their front or back, and many of them you can watch readily available Seattle video, for instance, where they will literally stand in the middle of a gap between police and rioters, right in the middle of the line of the rioters. So they're actively performing a shield function. Now, I'm not saying the majority of them do this, but once the court singled them out, there's no question that a number of the violent participants in these activities started to try to take advantage of it.
To those who accuse the United States of being a totalitarian state, I don't buy it, because I don't remember many hearings like this in Germany where you call the Gestapo in and ask, hey, who are you beating up and why? I don't remember any open press about what's going on, talking about the press. These things have been extensively covered. So I want to live in an America where the cops are held accountable. Do both of you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
If you wear a gun and badge, you have a lot of power, and your actions need to be judged and monitored. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
You
sir.
both agree with that? You also want to live in a country where people wear a badge and gun feel like you got their back, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many people have been prosecuted for the violence against DHS or DOJ officers? Are there any prosecutions in the making for the 200-something injuries?
There are. The exact number, I don't know the exact number of cases. I can tell you arrests.
Yeah, so currently out of the District of Oregon, Senator, we have 97 arrests.
Well, I'm going to be watching really hard whether or not the people who attack our officers are prosecuted. And I will join my Democratic colleagues to make sure that the IG looks really hard at any excessive use of force. I think most Americans are probably where I'm at. If a cop is going overboard, we want to know about it and take corrective action. But I think most Americans want to make sure that somebody who throws a brick or a frozen bottle of water or anything else at a police officer, that they have their day in court too. So I want to put you both on notice that we're going to hold you accountable for prosecuting those who hurt our cops. Now, if we'd done nothing, what would have happened to the courthouse, Mr. Cuccinelli, in Portland?
That courthouse wouldn't be there in any function.
So I challenge anybody on the other side to say different. If we hadn't intervened, they'd burn the goddamn thing down. Seattle. Were you in Seattle? Were either one of you in Seattle when they took over part of the town? Did we send anybody in there to help?
We were not requested, and there was no federal.
Well, they worked it out in Seattle after they took over part of the town. Being upset with what happened to Mr. Floyd is absolutely all-American. Trying to occupy part of a city and turn it into a socialist enclave, not. So we got a lot going on in this country, and I don't want to blend them in. Chicago. I don't know what's happening in Chicago, but this is not about Mr. Floyd. Young kids are getting killed just outside their house. Somebody needs to do something about it. So my point is that this committee, and I appreciate this, Senator Cruz, is going to look at all of it. And all of it means what's going on in Chicago and should the federal government help? How many kids have to die every weekend before enough is enough? As to the state police in Portland, I'm glad you're there. I hope it works out. But if you can't take care of it, we will. That's not being totalitarian. That's applying the law that exists in the United States today. It is a federal responsibility to protect federal property. You agree with that, Mr. Cuccinelli?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Cox, there are people out there who would kill you because of your race. Do you agree with that? White supremacist groups are alive and well in the United States.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Do you believe they're on the rise?
I believe that they've existed for some time, and as you
Well, I tell you, Mr. Ray, Director Ray said they're on the rise, and I believe that too. And I want you to bust their ass wherever you find them. We're not going to live in an America like this. So if you're a white supremacist, I hope you get a knock on your door soon. If you're engaging in violence, and I hope you go to jail. So from my point of view, I don't want any American, black, white, anything in between, having to be afraid to live in their own country, not being able to let their kids go outside and play at night, and can't go downtown to one of the major cities. So to both of you, thank you for your service. Pass on to those under your charge that we appreciate them, that at least I don't consider them Gestapo, but let them know if they get out of line, they'll be dealt with. That's what the rule is all about. Thank you for having this hearing.
Ayes is number one.
How many is that?
113 out of 277. That hearing is next, and then needless to say, what we euphemistically call contact with an object, which is.
And I will say for our Democratic members, earlier today, Mr. Cuccinelli actually showed me that commercial grade laser, and I thought, like a lot of people, it's like a laser pointer that you might see at home. What's interesting is that what Mr. Cuccinelli just did, shining it at your hand, if you do that, which I did, within a second, you'll yank your hand back because it burns. And as I understand it, they're using, it's not a little pointer, it's a serious weapon that they're using potentially to cause permanent blindness in law enforcement officers. Is that right?
That's the attempt, and the closer you get, the tougher it is. I've asked for this. This is a shield. It's hard to see. It's a rough shield. What I want to draw your attention to is the hole in the shield. So a tactic that quickly developed among the violent participants in these activities was to cut those holes in the shields, and instead of standing back at the back of a crowd and aiming at the eyes of officers, they will also now bring the shield up close and bring it right up into you. And so the intensity of the strike to the eyes of the officer is much more significant. For those of you who were engineers like me, it's a square function. So if you're twice as far away, it's a quarter of the energy. And the opposite is true. And these are the kinds of tools they're using, combined with just regular item you buy on Amazon, to do permanent damage that we haven't seen on this kind of scale ever before. As I said, 49 years for the Federal Protective Service, they have never seen anything like Portland.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cuccinelli, what happens when you take a laser and you point it into the eyes of a human being?
So the body has about a 0.2 second look away reaction. And one of the challenges, there are several, but one of the challenges is if you're not looking at the person assaulting you with the laser, you can't figure out who's performing the assault. So they're you know, you think of it practically, you're trying to shield your eye and still do your job. We've had a number of officers who had days-long blindness. So far, they've all kind of come back, if you will, but you also get what's called flash blindness. Think of it as the old Kodak cameras where you get that blue spot and you can't quite see your entire field of vision for a period of time.
I assume that for that moment, in addition to any long-term damage or short-term damage that it might do, for the time being, it also makes it more dangerous for the officer.
Absolutely.
As the officer recoils, as
And
the officer steps away from the harm.
The way multiple people sometimes work together in the crowd, that is a clearly planned exercise.
And to be clear, a device like this one, which can be bought anywhere by anyone, doesn't run out of its supply, at least not in a single protest. They can shine that all night long if they want to.
All night
right?
long.
And it can still do its harm. It's one of the things that I find so intriguing about all this is how it is, even in 2020, as crazy as this year is, it seems doubly crazy to me that we're using terms like this. We're conflating terms of peaceful protest and anarchist violence as if they were the same thing. Enforcing laws against one group of people but not another, or so we are told we should do, based on whether or not we agree with their ideological viewpoint. Now tell me about this picture right here.
So what you've got here is the most common laser that we've seen is the green. And, you know, the things you learn doing these jobs, your eye, the human eye, sees the green part of the spectrum more brightly than, say, red, something like 10 times brighter. And also, all of this is happening at night. There's peaceful protesting. This is sort of the Portland formula. There's peaceful protesting to 10 or 11 o'clock, and then they go away, and maybe some of them come back, but the group that comes back is, A, much bigger, but also they come back for violence.
So when my mom told me nothing good happens after midnight, she wasn't messing around.
Your mother was right, especially about Portland. You also see gasoline in the upper right corner of this picture. We've had accelerants poured into the courthouse while commercial-grade mortar-style fireworks were being shot into the doors in an attempt to light it. Also while the side doors, the exits of the building were being blocked, were being barricaded closed. So that was going on as well. And the last picture you see here, it's a little dark to see. They're holding a fire hose that they've hooked up to the courthouse. Now these are our CBP officers because the rioters, not the peaceful protesters, would continuously set fires. They'd throw a ton of trash over a fence, light it on fire, and they would also throw what amounted to homemade hand grenades. There is a video of this picture. This is a snap out of that video where you see two of those explosives coming in. Fortunately, they both explode early, so they don't get so close that they impact these officers. But you can see, rather obviously, the potential for harm with many of these devices. And this gun here was pulled off of one of the arrested protesters.
While widely available, equipment like this is being used in a somewhat novel way here. I assume this is the kind of thing you don't ordinarily expect to arise spontaneously. In other words, people have given this some thought.
They've given it a great deal of thought, and frankly, there's been evolution of the negative tactics over the course of time. If you look back out of Minneapolis, go back to where George Floyd was killed by that police officer, and then the fight that ensued in the streets of Minneapolis beyond just protesting, many of those violent participants got together and wrote up their lessons learned, sort of an after-action report for criminals. And they've published this, and you see the same thing going on in other parts of the country. Like, we can send you that rather long and extensive, and if you weren't evil, you'd read the quality of the material and you'd say that this is a high quality analysis. And that's on the other side. So that's what we're facing, and it's evolving all the time.
Does the federal government have what some would call general police powers?
No, absolutely not.
How does this differ from general police powers? I've been critical in many instances from federal law enforcement agencies stepping in and engaging in local police function. Tell me why I shouldn't have that concern here.
So all of the DHS officers are cross-designated as Federal Protective Service officers. They're all operating under the Federal Protective Service Authority to protect the courthouse. The marshals have the inside of the courthouse and protect it dutifully. FPS protects the outside. There's also 2 doors down, if you will, another federal building, and in between is the biggest local target of violence, the Multnomah Justice Center. So there's 3 buildings: courthouse, local Justice Center, federal building, and across the street from all 3 are parks, which have performed the function of staging areas for rioters, for criminals. And the powers being exercised by the federal authorities are to protect the federal facilities. That is it. Even when we go off those properties, which the statute from Congress says we can do, it is for the purpose of performing that function. So if someone assaults a law enforcement officer at the courthouse, we can go arrest that person anywhere in pursuit of that particular authority. But that doesn't mean we can police the streets of Portland and hand out tickets for speeding or doing other things, and that's for Portland and the state police to do.
But for these apparently orchestrated, violent, repeated attacks on federal courthouses and other federal personnel and facilities, would you have ever sent federal personnel into that zone?
Well, of course, the FPS officers are always there, but I assume you mean added more.
Yes.
Through June, FPS continued to add their own officers as the violence escalated. And if you look in May and June, we have a graphic compilation I can send to each of you that shows the number of days of attacks on federal facilities. And in May and June, that total was 12 for both months total. In July, as of July 29th, it was 29. So every single day. The escalation of the targeting of federal facilities led the commander on the scene of the Federal Protective Service to request supplemental Department of Homeland Security officers because they didn't have enough in the region and given their other duties any longer after they had already added their own. That's why pure circumstances on the ground at the request of the local commander, who has always been the regional commander there, and that region is a lively one with Portland and Seattle in the same region. They have some experience here. This has happened, not to this degree, but assaults on federal facilities happened 2 years ago, and the mayor of Portland publicly disclaimed police protection for that facility. And so we have
Thank you, Mr. Coote. I recognize y'all are constrained in terms of commenting on an active investigation, but I'll ask a simple hypothetical. If the only facts were as Senator Whitehouse suggested, if an individual were standing in a sweatshirt, engaged in no violence, standing there doing nothing, and any federal officer walked up and hit him 3 times with a baton for no reason whatsoever, if that's what occurred, you would be quite comfortable saying that is an abuse of power to beat someone with a baton for no reason. And to be clear, that's very different from if before the clip in question the individual engaged in an act of violence. I mean, the context in these investigations always matter. But if the only facts are, as Senator Whitehouse said, that someone was standing there and beaten for no reason, you'd be comfortable saying that is not, federal law enforcement officers are not allowed to beat people for no reasons.
We train them exactly the opposite.
And I would agree, federal law enforcement officers are not allowed to beat people.
But that's why you have investigations, because you don't know if those are the only facts or if there is other conduct perhaps not captured on a snippet on the internet.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, look, I know, as I said earlier, a good half this committee or so have been former attorneys general, have served in one relationship or another with law enforcement, and so I understand there to be a great deal of respect for law enforcement. Nor I assume anyone on this committee expects them to be perfect, while at the same time holding them to the kind of higher standard that Senator Whitehouse just referenced. That is all true, all at the same time. And we have to continue to enforce the law while correcting whatever mistakes do arise without stopping the enforcement of the law. Stopping the enforcement of the law here would end us up without a courthouse in Portland.
Senator Blackburn by video.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and for giving us the opportunity to have this hearing. I really appreciate it, and I know that our constituents, I hear from Tennesseans every single day about how very concerned they are. So let me just kind of follow on with where we are right now. Mr. Cuccinelli, let's talk about this. While your teams are out there stopping rioters, then how do they make that turn and protect peaceful protesters? Because they have to do each at the same time. So how do they work? How do they handle this? How do they try to segment the crowd so that people who are peaceful are protected and rioters who are there for the purpose of violence and injury and harm and destruction, so that they are properly dealt with?
So, Senator, that balance is so critical to their work. I appreciate the question, and it goes also to Senator Whitehouse's question, or two of them actually, that professional law enforcement officers encounter people in tense situations, and they're the ones we look to de-escalate. All of our officers are trained in de-escalation techniques. I would also note for you, just by way of one anecdote, in the middle of these in riots, so I believe it was marshals had detained an individual who had assaulted a law enforcement officer, and that person immediately had a seizure and was in immediate medical need. And nearby present were the CBP BORTAC is their SWAT team, BORSTAR is their medical team, immediately moved in, and the BORTAC team cleared the crowd. They had to actually dynamically move the crowd away to be able to help the person who had just been assaulting their colleagues moments before, and they obviously did that in partnership with the marshals, and went through a series of attempts to treat this individual, had 180 heart rate, respiration was way up, and finally identified a drug to be administered to stop the seizure and save that person's life. Within seconds of that same person having been attacking their fellow law enforcement officers. So, yes, what Senator Whitehouse referred to happened, and that investigation will go through, and it should. But understand, you don't see reported all of the protective steps that your professional law enforcement officers take every day, not just, as you'd suggested, Senator Blackburn, to protect peaceful protesters, which they are absolutely seeking to do, but to actually care for the very people who are harming them. And that kind of ability, that nimbleness, that flexibility, and strength is really a hallmark, by and large, of 99% plus of our officers. And while we have to fix the mistakes as they arise, we cannot sacrifice the rule of law to do that, and we do it in tandem with the protection of First Amendment rights. That's a huge part of why the larger number of officers is needed, so that you can maintain peace, not simply arrest people. So those protests can continue.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make, that they are protecting people who are coming peaceably to express their opinion and assemble. And at the same time, they are having to deal with these rioters who are there to destroy property, to harm people. And I think that speaks to the training and the professionalism, that when they put that uniform on, They don't know if it is going to be all peaceful protest,
Right.
or if there are going to be the disruptors and the destroyers that show up that they're going to have to deal with. So we thank these men and women for their commitment. Ms. Cox, I wanted to ask you, the DOJ task force that is looking at these extremist groups, and I want to drill down specifically to these that are on the streets carrying out the destruction. We keep hearing that these attacks are very organized. They come with the lasers and the bats and the pallets of bricks, and then they carry out their destruction. The work that you all are doing, are you figuring out who is organizing this, who is in charge, who is funding it, who is putting money behind these disruptive efforts?
Yes, Senator, that is part of the task force, and we will be looking into that. I mean, it's obvious to anyone that looks at it. There's some level of organization. We've seen also some coordination, some radio communication on the ground, and some jamming of law enforcement communication. I will tell you, though, that one thing that makes it incredibly hard is that we're finding evidence that some of these rioters are using encrypted apps. And I know Senator Blackburn has offered some legislation to deal with end-to-end encryption when law enforcement has probable cause and goes to a neutral magistrate to get access to those communications. That's very important in child exploitation cases and drug cases, and it's going to be very important here. So I would mention that, you know, these cases are challenging already, but we have several people that are looking into it.
Convene now that our witnesses have arrived. We have 5 witnesses on the second panel, 3 in person and 2 testifying remotely. The first witness is Mr. Andy No, who is an independent journalist and photographer who has provided Americans a window into the protests that have racked Portland and Seattle and the Pacific Northwest more broadly in the past several years. Mr. No is the editor-at-large at the Post-Millennial, and his written work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Real Clear Politics, and Fox News. Millions online have viewed his videos covering Antifa and related protests. Mr. No is a graduate of the University of California at Los Angeles and Portland State University. The second witness is Mr. Kyle Schittler. Mr. Schittler is the Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy. In that role, he researches and analyzes domestic threats with an emphasis on doctrines that fuel terrorism. Mr. Schittler's writing has appeared in The Federalist, The Hill, FoxNews.com, and the Claremont Review of Books. He is a graduate of Boston University and was a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute. Our next witness is Professor Jonathan Turley. Professor Turley is an attorney, a columnist, and currently the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at the George Washington University Law School. Professor Turley is nationally recognized for his scholarship in a diverse range of legal areas and has published dozens of academic articles in the nation's leading law journals. As a practicing attorney, Professor Turley has litigated several high-profile disputes throughout his legal career. He earned his J.D. from the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and his B.A. from the University of Chicago. Our next witness is Mr. Michael German. Mr. German is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. A former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mr. German served as the Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy for the American Civil Liberty Union's Washington Legislative Office. Our final witness is Ms. Nikenge Harmon Johnson. Ms. Harmon Johnson currently works as the President and CEO of the Urban League of Portland. Immediately prior to her current position, Ms. Harmon Johnson served in the office of the Governor of Oregon and the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Ms. Harmon Johnson is also a former staff member for U.S. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas and for U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow. I would ask each of the witnesses here in person to please stand and be sworn in. Raise your right hand, please. do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And now the rules provide that each of the long-distance witnesses must be separately sworn in. So, Ms. Harmon Johnson, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Senator Cruz, I do.
Mr. German, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Senator Cruz, I do.
Very good. We will start with the prepared testimony. Mr. No, you're recognized. Please make sure you've turned your microphone on, which is the switch right in the center of the microphone, on the base.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirono, and members of the committee. Antifa is not a myth. I have been reporting on its activities since 2016. Its threats to my family and me have proved all too real. As any good journalist knows, the most important stories are often those not being told. This story is not being told. The American public knows little about this violent insurrectionary group and its radical ideology. I made Antifa my beat, and that makes me a target. Its followers regard my reporting as a threat to their mission, so they use violence and intimidation to try to frighten me into silence. First, they tried to discredit me, falsely branding me as a white supremacist. I happen to be gay and the son of Vietnamese refugees, so that was surprising. Next, they threatened to kill me and hurt my family. They almost succeeded last year when they surrounded me in the middle of downtown Portland. I was beaten so badly that I was hospitalized for a subarachnoid hemorrhage. I still suffer from the effects of that injury. To this day, no one has been arrested. I'm apprehensive about speaking to Congress today, given that I'm a target. But I'm more afraid of the consequences of remaining silent. Unless we take action, what is happening in Portland today will soon be happening in cities across the country. What we've witnessed for more than 2 months in Portland are almost daily violent protests and riots led by Antifa. Even when they aren't starting fires, using explosives, and trying to maim officers, they leave threatening messages, such as decapitated pig heads outside the courthouse. Even after federal agencies agreed to pull back their visible presence starting July 30th, Antifa militants have attacked a Portland police building in a residential neighborhood on multiple occasions. Unfortunately, too many in the media have chosen to ignore or downplay this extremism masquerading as racial justice. In Portland, the violence has been organized and led by the local chapter of the Youth Liberation Front, a shadowy Antifa organization with secret membership. The Youth Liberation Front has cells across the U.S. organized on social media sites like Twitter. They openly advocate for violent uprisings in Portland and elsewhere. To give one example, on July 25th, they called for national calls to action. Their followers obliged. We witnessed weekend street violence in Seattle, Oakland, Austin, Atlanta, Richmond, among other cities. There were multiple shootings, dozens of officer injuries, and even a homicide. I have worked undercover for months in Portland and other cities, and I've seen with my own eyes how hundreds of so-called protesters work together to carry out acts of organized criminality against government and civilians. Both violent and nonviolent participants play a role. For example, Antifa, by their own admission, depend on mass numbers of peaceful protesters to act as human shields. Those privy to the organizational workings are divided into units, one to monitor police movement, one for street medics, one for vandals and arsonists, and so on. They coordinate on encrypted chat applications like Signal because they are extremely difficult for law enforcement to monitor. Antifa has mastered the art of making its violence appear innocuous. For example, projectiles that look like water balloons can be filled with chemicals. Small slingshots can be used to project rocks, glass, and ball bearings into police lines. Umbrella tips can be fastened with discreet pocket knives. Powerful handheld lasers can cause serious damage to the eyes. Antifa and its allies have made rioting an art form in Portland. They have access to a rich stream of cash flowing from platforms like GoFundMe, Venmo, and Cash App. Any conspirator arrested in Portland is instantly bailed out and ready for the next night of violent protest. I come to you today with a message for senators of both parties. Antifa's goal is not only to abolish the criminal justice system, it is to bring down the republic itself. Burn it down, they say. But don't take my word for it. Go read their literature, listen to their chants, and look at their graffiti messages. Portland is a canary in the coal mine for America. Look to my city to see what happens when a group like Antifa is left unchecked. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. No. Professor Turley.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. Ranking Member Hirano. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the growing threat of free speech in the United States from an array of extremist groups. The protests in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd have served to focus attention on the transcendent issue of racial discrimination. I think we all agree we cannot let this moment pass for a national dialogue on racial justice. That dialogue, however, is increasingly turning into a diatribe on our campuses, on our streets, even in our media. We're losing the opportunity to reach consensus because of rising violence and intolerance for opposing views. If we are to come together as a nation, we have to be able to speak to one another freely and without fear. I welcome this hearing because I fear that we are at a crossroads in this country on free speech. We're witnessing unprecedented erosion of this defining right in our democracy. The protests around this country involve a wide array of groups on the political spectrum, from both the far right and the far left. I discussed that in my written testimony. However, Antifa is arguably the most successful anti-speech movement of this generation, using physical threats and intimidation to silence those with dissenting views. It is all part of achieving what Antifa calls no platforming, or denying people with opposing views the ability to be heard. Recently, the alleged Antifa ringleader who led efforts to topple statues in Washington, D.C., proclaimed the movement is winning. He's right. They are winning. They're winning because universities are now effectively blocking conservative and opposing speakers. They're winning because the media and politicians downplay such violence. They're winning because local authorities are ordering police to stand down or prosecutors to drop charges. And they're winning because free speech is being treated as a destabilizing or threatening factor in our schools and society. In my written testimony, I explore ways for Congress to reinforce free speech through a mix of measures from federal enforcement to federal funding. It is by no means an easy task because government enforcement itself can chill free speech. However, threats against free speech have now reached a critical mass in our schools and on our streets. We can either act or we can remain passive pedestrians to what inevitably comes next. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler recently said that accounts of Antifa violence in places like Portland are a myth. Antifa is no myth. The decentralized organization and fluid communications used by Antifa groups give superficial support to such denials. Antifa trains members to remain anonymous. It's all here in the Antifa handbook, which explains the strategy of anonymity by mass to allow the offensive side of block tactics to flourish. Antifa was expressly founded as a movement at war with free speech, defining the right itself as a tool of oppression. That is also clearly stated in this handbook. The signature of the group is a self-righteous, rage-fueled violence that parallels fascistic groups that they claim to oppose. Tellingly, the Antifa handbook begins with the quote, "Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed." And fascism is a term that morphs into a wide variety of targets deemed unacceptable by Antifa, from capitalism to patriarchy to police. Antifa bears strong resemblance to groups that emerged in earlier periods of attacks on free speech, like the Red Scare. Simply replacing anti-communism with anti-fascism does not materially change the same anti-free speech purpose of these movements. The greatest threat to free speech in this country remains the original threat: silence. Silence kills free speech. It is the silence of professors who watch as their colleagues are threatened, harassed, or fired for voicing dissenting views. It's the silence of students who watch their fellow students as they are attacked for voicing their own beliefs. It is the silence of reporters who watch as their colleagues are fired or forced to retire for writing opposing views. Most importantly, it is the silence of politicians who refuse to protect the exercise of free speech. Let me end by saying that during the Red Scare, Attorney General Charles Gregory said this about dissenters: "May God have mercy on them, for they need to expect none from an outraged people and an avenging government." The avenging elements in our society are now found in groups like Antifa, and a growing number of writers, academics, and others who are embracing orthodoxy over diversity of thought. Antifa and related groups thrive through intimidation, and they prevail through inaction. All that is required for free speech to die in America is for America to be silent. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you. Mr. Schindler, your testimony now.
It's a great honor to testify today before the Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on the Constitution. The federal government has a fundamental responsibility to protect the civil rights of all of its citizens, and paramount among these rights are freedom of speech and assembly. I hope my testimony today will correct some fundamental misunderstandings regarding the nature of the movement known as Antifa, which seeks to deprive Americans of these rights. Antifa is an anarcho-communist movement whose goal is to use physical violence and intimidation to terrorize American citizens, to disengage them from the political process. While they do this under the cover of anti-fascism, the reality is that Antifa defines the entire American political system, regardless of party affiliation, as fascism. Antifa developed out of the communist urban guerrilla and terrorist movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s, such as the Weather Underground and Germany's Red Army faction. As a result, it possesses operational experience developed over more than half a century of radical left-wing organizing and political violence. Law enforcement has largely failed to understand the nature of this threat. Seeking a rigidly hierarchical organization, some analysts have even concluded, against all evidence, that Antifa does not exist in any meaningful sense. The reality is that Antifa demonstrates an elaborate but non-hierarchical structure. The most basic structure of Antifa is the affinity group, which is described by the pro-Antifa website CrimethInc. As the essential building block of anarchist organization. It's a small cell of individuals who are known to one another, who agree to come together to participate in direct actions. Those include sabotage, vandalism, and premeditated assault. Affinity groups then come together to form clusters, and a large cluster may organize actions using what are called spokes councils. Antifa chapters form at the city level and join regional networks such as Torch Antifa, the largest Antifa network in the United States, as well as national and international networks. Antifa websites describe in detail how to organize affinity groups and chapters, how to vet potential members, prevent infiltration, and securely communicate. Such websites play a key role in spreading propaganda, distributing new tactics, techniques, and procedures, and raising calls to action. One example, the Antifa website It's Going Down distributes a Forming an Antifa Group manual. Particularly noteworthy, the manual describes Antifa chapters as incurring obligations to support regional and national Antifa networks, who then in turn make greater resources available to chapters. This support extends internationally, with many American Antifa groups linked to the International Antifa Defense Fund, which has provided financial support to Antifa in 22 different countries. While overall dollar amounts are low, the International Antifa Defense Fund does represent clear evidence of organizational activity across national borders. Antifa relies heavily on support organizations such as the Democratic Socialists of America, the International Workers of the World, Refuse Fascism, and the National Lawyers Guild, and in coordination with other protest organizations. It is not uncommon for Antifa to require outside groups to sign what are essentially memorandums of understanding to ensure that allies agree not to interfere with criminal activity in exchange for protection. In terms of financing, remember that terrorism is a low-cost form of warfare. The entire 9/11 plot costs less than $500,000, and even by al-Qaeda standards, Antifa's low-intensity violence is extremely cost-efficient. They use a variety of methods to fundraise, including crowdfunding technology. The International Antifa Defense Fund has so far raised more than $53,000 via the crowdfunding website Fundraiser. While some of these crowdfunding companies are officially content neutral, others are explicitly ideological and only facilitate Antifa and similar projects. Antifa chapters also raise funds through event admission fees, cash donations, and by selling merchandise at anarchist book fairs. And many of their needs are provided free of charge by their allied organizations. These provide armed and unarmed training for Antifa members at no or low cost, and support organizations cover most major expenses, such as transportation, bail, and lawyers' fees. Other organizations, such as RiseUp.net, provide chapters with free access to secure servers, communication tools, and computer applications. Far from being non-existent, Antifa possesses as elaborate a structure as any criminal conspiracy or terror group. Claiming that Antifa is too disorganized to understand should not be an acceptable excuse for law enforcement, federal, state, or local, to tolerate Antifa's private street war to overthrow the Constitution. Like their predecessors in the Weather Underground and Red Army faction, Antifa will continue to escalate its behavior unless it is checked. There will be more attacks, and rioting techniques will continue to grow in capability and in sophistication. Their cadres will grow, and there will be more autonomous zones for increased periods of time. And more Americans of all political persuasions will be terrorized. Thank you.
Thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. No, let me start with you. Is Antifa violent, and what specific acts of violence have you personally witnessed?
Yes, they're violent, and I'll start with what I witnessed was what happened to me on the 29th of June, 2019. That was a ostensibly anti-racist protest that was organized in downtown Portland. It involved Rose City Antifa, which is an organization. It involved the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I came there with my GoPro and my iPhone to record, and I was beaten by a mob, people who use brass knuckles that were hidden under gloves, punching me repeatedly in the front, the top, and the back of my head. And then when I thought they were done, that was just the half of it. Next came all those milkshakes and other unknown liquids that were hurled at my face. And I know milkshakes can sound kind of cute as a protest, but really when they're thrown at force in your face, it's a viscous liquid. You can't see where to go. So that was one of my first experiences with their violence directly. Since then, I've seen numerous times in Portland.
And is it right that you received significant injuries from that?
Yes, a brain bleed from that.
Please continue, I'm sorry.
And I wasn't the only victim that day. There were 7 other people who were hospitalized. There was only one conviction related to another person who was assaulted, beaten on the head with a brick and a baton and other weapons. Portland is the epicenter. It's been going on since 2016, really in response to the surprise election win of Trump. And what I see happening there is the local politicians have been sort of nurturing and allowing this extremism to go on. And that's why it's in the predicament that it's in now, where there's over 2 months of violent protests. And I see all these headlines talking about how things are peaceful now because the federal authorities are less visible. That's inaccurate. That's a falsehood. Yesterday and the day before, where the attacks happened, instead of the federal court downtown, Antifa Black Bloc militants tried a new tactic. They attacked the Southeast Precinct in Southeast Portland. So this problem is not going away. It's continuing, and Hopefully, my testimony here to Congress shows that I don't come with a partisan message. If you read their literature, they're very clear in calling for the abolishment in the U.S.
Professor Turley, you testify that Antifa is profoundly anti-speech and violent. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, if you go through the Antifa handbook and look at their literature, it's quite express. You know, as stated in the handbook, they reject the premise of what they call a classical liberal view of free speech. Specifically, they object to statements like, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I would give my life to defend it. They reject that. They believe that free speech itself is a tool of oppression. And that has been the message on campuses. What I thought was disturbing about these statements that Antifa is a myth is that many of us on campus have been dealing with Antifa for years, and Antifa is winning. I mean, there is a tremendous movement, an anti-free speech movement in the United States. My testimony doesn't really go to these protests. I think that both the far right and far left are doing bad things in these protests. Antifa members have been arrested in these protests. Antifa groups like Rose City Antifa have been leading some of these efforts. But my greater concern, and the one that I would hope that members would look at, is this anti-free speech movement that Antifa is part of. I've been teaching for 30 years. I have never seen the level of fear and intimidation on campuses that we see today. Faculty are afraid to speak out about issues. We can't have a dialogue about the important issues occurring today because there's a fear that you might be accused of being reactionary or racist. We've had law professors who've been physically attacked, have required police protection. That's the environment that we're developing. And for people that think that Antifa and groups like it can be allies, they don't know Antifa. And those of us who've been teaching on campuses can tell you about these groups. And the alarm that I have is because I'm watching my profession, the teaching profession, die with free speech. Administrators are not protecting academic freedom. Why should they protect free speech? We're seeing that many of these speakers are being prevented from speaking on campus under various theories. And the message is clear to faculty, it's clear to students. There's a new orthodoxy that you should not confront and you certainly shouldn't disagree with. And I go through those details in my testimony.
So, Professor Turley, I very much agree with you that we ought to be united in condemning violence from whatever ideological origin it comes from, whether right-wing, left-wing, or no wing at all. If you're committing violence against fellow Americans, that ought to be condemned, you ought to be arrested, you ought to be prosecuted, you ought to go to jail. I do think it is striking that in the entire course of this hearing, 7 Democratic senators spoke in this hearing. Not a single Democratic senator condemned Antifa. Not a one of them condemned Antifa's violence and terrorism. Do you think it is harmful? The sitting Attorney General of Minnesota, a Democrat, posed with the book you just held up in your testimony, the Antifa Handbook, gleefully modeling it. Do you think it is helpful for elected Democrats to be holding out a violent anti-speech organization like Antifa and acting essentially as apologists for it? Is that good for our democracy?
You know, I criticized Mr. Ellison for that tweet. There are some Democratic politicians that have not only failed to denounce Antifa, but have actually, in that case, seemed to give it a shout-out. In that case, Mr. Ellison said that they would put the fear in the heart of Donald Trump. But what he doesn't see is that Antifa is putting the fear in the hearts of many people other than Donald Trump. If you go to campuses today, you will find more advocates for limiting speech than protecting it. They're winning. And when you see pictures like Mr. Ellison's picture with Antifa, it's very disturbing because Antifa is not coming after him. They're not even coming after Democrats. They're coming after Republicans, conservatives, and those of us in the free speech community. They're coming after us. But don't think we'll be the last ones. That's not how this works.
And I will also note that I'm Cuban American and white supremacists hate me too. But at the same time, it's fairly striking that elected Democrats want to ignore the violence of Antifa. They want to ignore the violence on the left, and they just scream white supremacists, rather than condemn violence from wherever it is coming. The 277 injuries of federal law enforcement officers in Portland are coming from the left, and not a single Democrat on this committee acknowledges that. David Dorn, African-American police officer, was murdered. Retired police officer in St. Louis, who is black, was murdered. Not a single one of the seven Democratic senators who spoke at this hearing mentioned David Dorn's name. Patrick Underwood, another officer. Senator Durbin was the one Democrat who mentioned Patrick Underwood's name. Another black officer murdered. We see Democrats who repeat the slogan, Black Lives Matter, but apparently those black lives are not worth discussing. The black lives of police officers murdered by terrorists. I would note as well, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, as a proposition, the statement Black Lives Matter is unquestionably true. It is a truism, it is indisputable, period, full stop. Black lives matter and matter enormously. Every human being is a precious gift from God. That being said, and quite rightly, the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with the proposition Black Lives Matter. It should be 100% of Americans agree with the proposition Black Lives Matter. That is different, I would note, than the specific organization that has taken up the name Black Lives Matter. And I think it is important to draw a distinction between the statement Black Lives Matter, that is indisputably right, and the organization that it denominated Black Lives Matter. That organization was founded in 2013. It was founded by three self-described radical Marxists. The three founders of it were Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Kahn-Cullors. And some of the facts behind this organization, Black Lives Matter, are important for people to know. Cullors said she and Garza, this is her words, are, quote, trained Marxists. And she said, quote, I read, I study, adding Mao, Marx, and Lenin to my knowledge of books. Mao, Marx, and Lenin, or Mao and Lenin, rather, murdered millions, were among the worst tyrants humanity has ever known. The Black Lives Matter group, their founders, have explicitly praised Marxist Angela Davis. Now, who is Angela Davis? They said she's a mentor. Angela Davis was the Communist Party vice presidential nominee in 1980 and 1984. She's explicitly a communist. She was affiliated with the Black Panther Party. Cullors, one of the three founders of the Black Lives Matter organization, said, quote, Angela Davis is a mentor of mine. Not only that, the founders have praised domestic terrorist Assata Shakur. Now, who is that? Assata Shakur is a convicted cop killer, murdered a police officer. She is right now today on the FBI's most wanted list and is likely a fugitive in Cuba. And by the way, it isn't just a passing praise. Ms. Cullors wrote a memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir that included a foreword written by communist Angela Davis. And by the way, it's not me calling her a communist. She was the vice presidential nominee of the Communist Party. She is explicitly a communist. And an opening epigraph from Shakur, the cop killer on the FBI's most wanted list. Not only that, in terms of funding, the organization BLM is financially sponsored by the Thousand Currents, an organization vice-chaired by Susan Rosenberg. Who's Rosenberg? A member of the leftist violent terrorist organization, the May 19th Communist Organization, involved in multiple politically motivated bombings. Now, what does the organization Black Lives Matter support? When you go to their website, they tell you they're not hiding it. Their top priority is defunding the police across the United States of America. It's not defending equal justice for everyone. That everyone supports. It is abolishing and defunding police departments in every community in this country. Not only that, the group BLM has a long record of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attacks, including arguing that Israel is a, quote, apartheid state that is committing genocide. And by the way, the BLM founders who revere Angela Davis's record, profoundly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Indeed, she was asked, would she be willing to speak up on behalf of Jewish prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union? She was a big apologist for the Soviet Union, and she responded when she visited Moscow. So she's meeting with the Soviet leaders in Moscow, and her response was, instead of speaking up for the Jewish prisoners of conscience, she would urge that they be kept in prison because, quote, they are all Zionist, fascist, and opponents of socialism. What else does BLM, the organization, support? On its website, it has called for a, quote, boycott of white capitalism. In 2017, they called on people not to spend any money with white corporations. And not only that, the BLM website says that one of their objectives is dismantling the, quote, patriarchal practices and disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family. That's what they say their objectives are. Now, the reason that matters is right now corporate America is desperate to demonstrate their virtue as we see great racial dissension. So Black Lives Matter, BLM, the group, raises money on Act Blue, the fundraising mechanism for virtually every elected Democrat in Congress. Among the donors to BLM, the organization, according to public reports, include the company Ubisoft, which has given between $50,000 and $100,000, DoorDash, which has given reportedly $500,000, Amazon, which has given an unidentified portion of $10 million, Gatorade, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Nabisco, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Deckers, which has given an unidentified portion of $500,000, Microsoft, which has given $250,000, Dropbox, which has given $500,000, and Fitbit, which the amount given is not identified. I would note Microsoft, the largest individual shareholder, is Bill Gates. It's more than ironic that Microsoft is funding an organization calling for boycotting all white corporations. Bill Gates is white. Microsoft is literally funding an organization calling for Microsoft to be defunded. Jeff Bezos, the largest owner of Amazon, who likewise is funding this radical Marxist group, Jeff Bezos is white too. And he's funding an organization that is calling for the boycotting of Amazon. This is dangerous, and it's worth understanding that when corporate America floods millions of dollars into explicitly Marxist terrorist organizations that glorify cop killers, that glorify violence, that the violence and terrorism that flows from that should not be surprising. Without objection, I'm going to enter into the record an article from the Washington Examiner dated July 23, 2020, the title of which is, "Who is Black Lives Matter?" And I would encourage anyone who wants to understand who this organization is to read this article. On the proposition as a value proposition, do Black Lives Matter? Absolutely yes. And our nation was founded on the proposition that all men are created equal, regardless of race or skin color. But the organization that has seized that name is very different, and if they succeeded with their stated #1 objective of defunding and abolishing every police department, many, many more black lives would be lost because more African Americans would be murdered without the police officers that bravely risk their lives to defend those communities. Well, I appreciate the, as always, kind and uplifting words of Senator Hirono. And I would also note that throughout her remarks, she still did not say a negative word about Antifa, nor has any Democrat here They instead engage in a political game where they depend. You're welcome to say something negative about Antifa right now.
I think that I've covered the subject quite well. You are not listening.
Okay, she declined to speak, so that is the position of the Democratic Party. I would note also that of the 7 Democratic senators who spoke, not a one of them apologized for or denounced multiple Democrats calling law enforcement officers Nazis, stormtroopers and Gestapo, to be fair. I have not heard the word Nazi, but stormtrooper was Nancy Pelosi and Gestapo was another Democratic leader. That is less than helpful. I thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. I thank you for defending free speech. And I thank you for speaking out against violence and against terrorism. The record in this hearing will be held open for 1 week. Senators may follow up with the witnesses of either this panel or the previous panel with written questions. If you receive written questions, you are asked to submit the answers to those questions by the close of business 1 week from today. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.